I think I heard one of our peers, who's a brilliant theologian of our generation, said that, and he was happy about it, but de facto, history is the new metaphysics for contemporary academia, just in terms of and so, and that's what everyone's recognizes that history can't be ignored. But the one thing is we have to ask is what exactly is this? And this is why Aristotle, again, maybe one doesn't follow Aristotle, but like history for him is an art. It's dialectic. That's why it has to have a motivational, because you don't have contact with things as past. It's not a specific, but yet, of course, we can trace genealogies because of artifacts and writings and things. But there's the contingency that's proper to history, which doesn't have a suppositality in the same way that being, whether that's ens mobile physics, ens ut ens metaphysics, or even God as being does. This, I think, the question about what is history and how does it work in sacred theology? Everyone knows it has to. And then you get with Scripture, divinely inspired history. That's a unique thing that's different from philosophical considerations of history. But all of us today are using historical methods and historical consciousness and other things, and yet kind of the meta-historiography of theology and history. I think this is a question he's asked. No one wants to get rid of history entirely, but what is it, how do we do?
Go back to one of your illustrious conference, Eve Congar, time and again comes back this distinction between, what does he call it? I think he calls it dogmatic history and just history in general, or something along those lines, or it might even call it like the, Christian history, because I think he thinks that there's that in understanding the significance of history, not just as one event after another, but as kind of a process that has some motivation, that's moving towards an end, and so forth. You have to have principles of selection. You have to have a certain angle by which you consider it. And so that's, for him, one of the key principles is that when you're looking to show that that a doctrine has been transmitted in the course of history, sometimes you might say the gaps in the documentary, evidence there would seem at a purely human level to suggest that there was not transmission. But we also see that that there's this kind of dogmatic history which supposes that anything that emerges had to have come from somewhere. So even if there's a little lead pipe underground that continued to carry this tradition, that's a little bit hard to verify from, let's say, critical historiographical points of view, that nevertheless it was being transmitted, right? And so he begins to already distinguish between these different levels. And so these are...
and with that, if I might ask you the anecdote you shared off camera, where as academics and historians and philosophical historians, historical theologians, history in the academic discipline of theology or even philosophy is tied to textuality often, which is an objective basis. And yet, with Professor Noon, God be good to him, he pointed out something that there's a limit there. And he was a master historian, but do you mind, Dr. DeClue, sharing that?
Yeah, it was at a conference, and he just made the point, because some people would make these arguments that, well, some people speculate that, this philosopher X was influenced by philosopher Y, but that's not possible because philosopher Y didn't publish that until this year, which is 3 years after the other guy said it. So if anything, the connection would be the opposite direction or something. And he's like, and I'm highly paraphrasing from memory from a couple of years ago, but his point was like, people don't understand that back in those days, the most common form of interaction between these figures was oral, not written. And so just because that person didn't publish that work doesn't mean they weren't already talking about it for years before that work was put into writing or published. And so the idea that he couldn't have been influenced because of the date on the page is myopic, and it doesn't understand the historical context. And that a lot of these conversations were happening orally, and you're not going to have a record of that by the nature of an oral conversation, but it doesn't mean it wasn't there.
And that's a challenge for the historical method then which again, we all know it has to be there, but that's a challenge for that method.
And a particular challenge when the lead pipe is effectively the Sensus Fidei,
right,
guided by,
right.
That's what it is, because that's where it's living, effectively. Sometimes where you don't have the explicit sort of record.
Right, and that's what justifies separating these different planes of history, and I think that's,
which is part of the reason liturgical the liturgy is a source of theology because a lot of that sensus fidei is expressed in what we're celebrating.